But let's talk about Radu first, because he's next on our list. And it's funny you've chosen him playing the A minor sonata, which is the first thing I think I ever heard of his. And in fact, I was dropped off. Somebody was waiting. The violinist Krisha Rostropovich, she and Susan Tomes and I, when I was about 19 or 20, we were meant to be playing concert together, and Sue dropped us in the car, and somehow we went to Krisha's room to pick up something, and she said, "Oh, just while Sue's turning the car around, I have to play you this recording of Radu Lupu playing Schubert," and she played this A minor sonata. And 10 minutes later, Sue appeared. I said, "What happened to you?" And I just hadn't noticed. I was just completely...
Well, funnily enough that you say that, because the first thing I ever heard him play was in a concert. I heard him muck around on the piano, which was all high class mucking around, but he said, "Come to a concert, I'm playing at the Romanian embassy in Moscow." Mm-hmm. And he did a Schubert program. He did the Opus 90 impromptus and the A minor sonata. And I promise you, I was so shocked, in a good sense, but I just felt, I've been living in Moscow all these years. I've heard all these great piano players. I've never heard piano playing like this, and I've never heard Schubert played like this. And I really was speechless. I just couldn't say what I felt. It was enormous, enormous, enormous impression, which I can never forget. And of course, the initial way he played that sonata for me is always different from the recording. The recording has less effect. And probably he would say the record, "Oh, it's not that good,"
Well, he'd probably say the same. He'd probably say the same about the concert. To be fair,
no.
Anything he did.
Interestingly enough, now I don't know whether this happens to you, but artists sometimes are not the people to judge their own performances. There was a time in London when Radu played at the St. John Smith Square, and he played the Brahms third piano sonata. And he was happy with it. He said, "Oh, I really think I played quite well." Now, as you know, these concerts were broadcast on the BBC, and they did a repeat broadcast 2 or 3 days later. So he said, I'll definitely listen. He listened and said, "Oh, it was not so good." It was shit, And I thought, well, there you are.
So let's hear a bit of Radu Lupu playing Schubert. Maybe it was not the same as live, but boy, it's beautiful. So that was Radu Lupu playing some of the first movement of Schubert's A minor piano sonata, Deutsch 784. And Radu, of course, I only really got to know Radu much later in his career. I was very, very, very honoured to do his last concert with him, two of his last three concerts. Yeah, he's totally adorable, and you seem to be on extremely good terms, the two of you. Very close.
Yes, it's wonderful. I heard your beautiful performance of Schumann at your birthday concert, and he played a divine Opus 117 of Brahms.
Gorgeous.
To die for. Funnily enough, though, in Moscow, Radu was considered to be an incredibly talented musician, but everybody thought he was not a pianist. And kind of, they would say, very, very talented. He'll make a great conductor. He's not really a pianist. And we kind of looked at them and thought, what are they talking about? But and he himself, you see, came to Moscow as a composer, not as a pianist. Yeah, you didn't know that, but he was a wunderkind composer.
What happened to his compositions?
Well, I think he lost interest, or he felt that he didn't have enough ideas to develop them into interesting things. And he became more and more interested in the piano. But when he came to Moscow, what he mostly played was symphonic repertoire. And he was kind of famous for that. And people who played string instruments, like violinists, would always ask him, please, Radu, can you accompany me? I'm playing the Tchaikovsky concerto or the Beethoven concerto. Because he'd come and he didn't have a score. He didn't want a piano score because he did his own version. And he knew these works. And of course, he evoked the orchestra in a way that was extraordinary. And so they all thought that was what he was good at, and it was orchestral stuff. And he, even when he played for Neuhaus, Heinrich Neuhaus, father, he played some orchestral transcriptions. And funnily enough, the very first time I heard him play or saw him, I was a new student, right at the beginning, and I had run out of sugar in my room, and my roommate said, just go across the corridor, there are a couple of girls there and they'll give you some sugar, and you knock at the door. So I knocked at the door and I could hear the sounds of a Haydn London symphony being played on the piano, and it was very unusual. In Moscow nobody played Haydn except for the cello concerto, but on a few of the piano sonatas, but a Haydn symphony you wouldn't expect to hear. And so I was quite interested, and I walked in and there was this young man at the piano who kind of continued playing, turned around and looked at me, and then I got my sugar and walked out because I didn't dare ask if I could stay, and that was it. But I mean that was definitely it. And when he came back to Russia, you have to know he's interrupted his studies to go and play in competitions, one in Vienna and the other in Texas in Fort Worth, and he won the Van Cliburn piano competition. In 1966 he won first prize. And the Russians were furious. They said, oh, if we'd sent a team, he wouldn't have had a chance, our this and that would have won, Anyway, that was fine. And then the interesting part of the story is that later when we were together, I, for some reason, got sent by somebody in Leeds who were putting together the brochure for the 1969 piano competition in Leeds. This time they decided to put a section in Russian, and they asked me if I would correct the Russian in the brochure. So I had it, it came to my room and I opened it and looked and I said, oh, look, Radu, there's written this in Russian, there's yet another piano competition. And so he took it and looked at it. I've got that in the program. Look at the program. I could do this. I said, well, you don't want to go. You've already won 2 first prizes. What are you going to do to go to another piano competition? Oh, no, I think I'll go. And then the Russian, the dean of the piano faculty came up to him and said, Comrade Lupu, I think you should not go to Leeds. You already have 2 first prizes and you'll fall off your pedestal, not a good idea. And anyway, we know what happened. He won the Leeds 1969 piano competition, although it wasn't as simple as you might think, but that's another story. He very nearly didn't get past into the finale, and
really?
Very nearly didn't, and it was because of the Soviet competitors that he did get in, because what was happened, they were only going to let 3 people into the finale, and they were all none of them were Russian or Russian trained. And so the Soviet jury members said, we can't have this. I have to have my Soviet competitor in there. And Radu was above him in the votes, so they could only have the Soviet competitor if they had Radu. And they let them into the finale. So they had 5 pianists in the finale, which was unusual. And what happened then, I was terrified when I found out about it. I said, Radu, it's awful. That's a terrible jury. And Radu said to me, Lisa, for God's sake, stop worrying. If I play with orchestra, there's no problem. And he was right, because once he played with orchestra, he was the only pianist who understood an orchestra and knew how to play with an orchestra. And you know, he then, of course, won unanimously. But I just thought how wonderful he had that faith in himself.
But he doesn't have faith in himself anymore. Well, of course, he never touches the piano anymore. He hasn't touched it since June the 21st, 2019, which was his last concert, in which I had to direct the orchestra, the Lucerne Symphony. Did I send you
what was it?
Well, we did the Schumann Romances again.
Yes.
It was much better than the Wigmore, I must say. And then he did K488, Mozart. And I directed the orchestra. Not very well, but I did direct them, and how he played beautifully. I mean, it's of course very soft by then, very weak, some people might say, but it's so beautiful. But he hasn't touched it. Oh no, he did. He played for a party after that and decided he couldn't play, and he hasn't touched the piano since. He's watched a lot of television.
Well, I have no words.
I know, it's so frustrating. But anyway, he's wonderful and adorable. You were married for a long time, were you not?
Well, we were. It was about we were together for about 13 years. 13 years, and
there was just Patrick Gale, you know, his novel about the cellist. There's a cello teacher in Scotland who's based on my teacher, Jane Cowan. But there's also another cello teacher at his home who's based on you, or partly based on you.
Oh.
Did you not know that? Because he used to.
Oh yes. So wait a minute. This is Patrick Gale. Yes. Well, you told me that. I wouldn't have known otherwise. And reading it, I don't know that I would have known. But I'm sort of half flattered. But,
well, he adored you. He said you come and give concerts with Radu, and he said he could just see electricity running through your hair as you played. He loved that.
Yes, that was part of my life when I came back to London. And Radu, of course, I had won the Leeds competition, had an enormous career straight away. That was wonderful. And I came back, and I'd been living outside England for 7 years. And it was actually very difficult for me to find my own niche and to want to continue to be a musician and to play the cello and to do things. And, you know, I had my own piano duo. I then made a piano trio. And funnily enough, I went to Winchester College, which is where your one-time wonderful teacher, Jane Cowan, taught for many years. And I had her job. So I always felt that was, for me, a wonderful kind of symbol that a woman cellist like Jane had that job. And I felt it gave me a little bit of pride in the job.
My late wife, Pauline, I know her because she taught at Winchester, and she met still my best friend since I was 16, David Waterman. He was teaching cello, and so they met, and that's how I met Pauline. Also through Winchester, all roads lead to Winchester. And then John Kavanagh's funeral was there too. So.
Goodness me, yes, it's an extraordinary word. And I played a duo with a pianist called Catherine Sturrock, who lives in Putney, my Putney pianist friend, and she was a great friend, and she was also a great friend of Lucy Cowan, and I played a couple of concerts with Lucy as well, which I really enjoyed. Did various duos, and one time Catherine said, we must go and have a lesson with Jane, and we went and played Hindemith Opus 11, number 3 sonata for her. And she was wonderful. She was just fantastic. And of course, she knew Hindemith and she was talking about him. I don't know. And
that's great. I remember you coming to the Cello Centre, when I was a little boy. And Jane used to go, sorry, this is slightly off topic, but Jane said that Rostropovich took the train to Aldborough, especially to give you a lesson, or from Aldborough. She used to go on about that. Was that true? There's lots of publicity that Rostropovich, took a train somewhere to give you a lesson, and I don't know. Jane always went on about that story.
Gave me a lesson.
Yeah, that he took a train specially to or from Aldborough to give you a lesson.
No, it's not true. I mean, what I did at Aldborough, he gave a masterclass and I translated for it. That's the only thing I can think of. And he gave me his copy of the third cello suite at that occasion, so I remember that.
Did?
Yes.
Wow.
Well, I mean, you know, it was the first printed copy.
Oh, I see, yes.
When he came out. No, not a manuscript. He did give me, now funnily enough, he gave me the last bars, a manuscript of Britain, the last bars at the end of the second suite, which he asked Britain to change, because originally, you know, it starts from the top and goes lum bum bum ba-dum, ba-dum. It goes from top of the cello, from a D right down to the bottom. And in the original, it was the opposite. It went from the bottom up to the top. And he thought it would be more effective the other way around. So Britain rewrote it for him. And he gave me the strip of manuscript from which the new ending was. And you know what I did? I gave it back to him, because I thought, whatever, you know, it's actually a valuable piece of musical information. And I thought it shouldn't be in a private archive. It should be in an archive where you would expect to find the Britain cello suite. And the Rostropovich archive was a sensible one. I thought I shouldn't have it. And so I said, I think, would you keep it with the original?
Wow. That's very noble.
No, it's just that I work in the archives nowadays when I write books, and therefore I understand the value of them.
Yes. Talking of which, sorry, keep going, sort of off topic, I remember you doing some fascinating project of sort of the really strange Russian composers, probably in the early years of the 20th century, even stranger than Scriabin, people who made Scriabin look normal, like, I suppose, Obukhov, was that?
Obukhov was one of them. He lived in Paris. So.
Yes. You did a project on Russian composers in Paris?
I did. It's called Music and Revolution, and it was actually what happened was that in Paris they had this big exhibition, Moscow, Paris, and it was about the sort of years, the 1920s, the 1910s, when there was all this burst of avant-garde experiment, and complementary to the visual arts exhibition, they had a series of concerts in Paris. And I'd already heard a lot of this music in Russia, and I got copies of it and did these concerts with readings from poets and things of the time. So that was what I did. And Rostropovich was another one who wrote quite a lot for cello, and wonderful piano trio, fantastic third string quartet, absolutely amazing.
But he's more normal, right? He's the sort of proper composer, whereas Obukhov was a maniac. Right.
Obukhov was a maniac, and he had, yes, absolutely. But then you had Vishnegradsky, who was another one who wrote quarter tone music, fantastic quarter tone quartets that I've played.
I remember you telling me about a song by one of them, and I sort of assume it's Obukhov, the sort of one note you have to sing in the rhythm of the universe or something. I can't remember. I remember you describing this.
Yes, well, there were several of these composers, but Obukhov would have everything sort of screams and whistles and goodness knows what all together. But it was very mystical. It was sort of not revolutionary in the sense he believed in mystic experiences. Yeah. And you could do that in Paris, but you couldn't do it in Moscow any longer.
And I remember you also telling me, and I've often quoted this, but it's good to be able to check back with you, that Balakirev went around Moscow hitting Jews with a stick.
Well, he was known as a kind of a black shirt and a Jew basher. Yeah, I mean, anti-Semite. But, you know, you can read quite a lot of anti-Jewish stuff in Mussorgsky, for instance. At the same time, you have the most wonderful kind of Jewish music that he wrote.
Yes.
And, you know, there are the various songs which use it. I think there was a kind of, what shall I say, ambiguous feeling here. I don't think that Mussorgsky was a genuine sort of anti-Semite personally, and I think he had great respect for the culture, but
as a nationalist,
as Shostakovich did, of course, in that
and even Prokofiev.
Yes,
routines.
Yes, but it was also very different. I think that Shostakovich had a deeper feeling for the what the Jews went through than the Prokofiev did.
Certainly did. The second piano trio.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, so we're back to Shostakovich, and you've chosen the Borodin String Quartet. So, why have you chosen this?
Well, the Borodin String Quartet, for me, I knew them quite well, and in their first first formation had this wonderful violinist called Rostislav Dubinsky. And then when he left to go to America, they got an equally wonderful first violinist for their second formation. And those were the great years when they recorded. They did 2 complete recordings of the Shostakovich quartets with the 2 different violinists. Actually, not complete, because with Dubinsky, he had written the 13th. He hadn't yet written the 14th and 15th quartet. So it's up to the 1 to 13.
And you believe Dubinsky's book? Doesn't he accuse Berlinski of being a spy?
Dubinsky did, yes. Dubinsky wrote quite an argumentative book. And funnily enough, I was in Ann Arbor when they were doing a Shostakovich cycle, and Dubinsky lived a few universities away in Indiana, and he came up and they had a reunion, and they had they forgave each other, got very drunk, had a lot of vodka.
Was it true that Berlinski was a spy?
Well, he wasn't a spy, but I think he could sometimes, how can I put this politely? He could sometimes curry favor in the right order, something like that. I mean, I think people, had an enormous respect for Berlinski, but they knew he could behave maybe not quite in the right way, but certainly not a spy. And I think you have to understand that in the Soviet Union in those days, everybody got asked to give information about each other. Mostly it was just to check, what other people in the group were saying. Yeah. And that was so alarming. And Slava had a big bust up with Leonid Kogan because he reported back something and he was prevented from going to London. He found it out. And everybody knew that Kogan had got into trouble during the war because he has friends with an American allied journalist in 1945, which was perfectly permissible at the time. But then by 1946, it was no longer permissible. So they had him by the short and curlies and said, just every now and then give us a bit of information and things like that. So Shostakovich would call him the violinist with epaulets, medals, And
Kabalevsky also.
Well, Kabalevsky was a prime example, unfortunately.
He's such a good composer. He's a wonderful.
I know, it's bad luck. Well, I mean, Kogan was the most brilliant violinist, fantastic violinist. So unfortunately had nothing to do with it. And I think if anybody wants to know about that, they can read Ashkenazy's memoirs about how he was called up and taken to the Metropole Hotel and asked to give information. But usually what happened, the people would do that and they'd go along and say, listen, I've been asked to give information about you, so don't say anything in front of me, or else, I'm just going to pretend I'm mad, or I speak in my sleep or something. They would try and get out of it, but it was just a well-known phenomenon.
Yeah.
And unfortunately,
yeah.
So no, I said unfortunately, it made life very difficult for artists. And the idea was to make you suspicious of everybody. But
Ashkenazy, though, was very nice about Kabalevsky, because I played, well enough, on the same tour in the States. I played Britten Cello Symphony with Rostropovich conducting. And then I had to tell him that I was going to play Kabalevsky second concerto in New York on that same trip with Ashkenazy. And I was slightly nervous about telling Rostropovich that, because he knew, of course, that Kabalevsky too was a Shafran piece, and they were not the best of friends. I mean, I never dared mention the name Shafran to Rostropovich. I mentioned, or rather Shafran mentioned Rostropovich to me without too much love, I have to say. My dear colleague, he used to call him. But Ashkenazy, he'd heard the Kabalevsky second concerto on the radio, and he said this is where his sadness inside about everything comes out. And he was actually very touched by the music and wanted to do it, and so we did it.
Well, it's a good work, and so is the cello sonata is a good work, and you play it beautifully. But but having said that, I mean, I heard Rostropovich say very nice things about Shafran. And I mean, they weren't friends, but I have to say one thing, it's Rostropovich, he had enormous self-confidence and he had no reason to be put people down. There was room for more cellists in the world than just him. And he could make, but, and when he went to America for the first time and he was asked back, he said, well, you should invite this wonderful cellist, Shafran. You should get him to come.
That's very nice.
So, you know, I don't think Rostropovich was worried. He knew he'd go back to America in any case. It just didn't go next year. He'd go the year after. So what?
Right, it should be. But I have to say, since I'm being indiscreet, that Shafran's daughter told me that Rostropovich once saw caught sight of Shafran in the St. Petersburg Conservatoire and said to him, "What are you doing here, you son of a..." And she wrote it B-E-A-C-H, so son of a beach.
Oh well.
Family felt he was. Well, who knows? It's such a murky world, the Soviet world.
Yeah, well, it's impossible to verify everything, isn't it? But I mean, I know there were things he didn't like about Shafran's playing. He didn't like the fast vibrato or what, you know, things like that, and probably the things that vice versa. They were different kinds of artists. It was as simple as that. And but there's room for them both, really, I think.
I think it was proven. Yes. Okay. Sorry. The Borodin Quartet. There's so much I want to ask you. I keep getting distracted. So the Borodin Quartet, we have here playing part of the 12th quartet. Why did you choose the 12th
quartet? Yes.
Yeah. Why? Why the 12th?
1968. It's a work. It's a kind of intermediary work in Shostakovich's, if you like, his last period. He's about to go into the last period. What's interesting about it is that he's like a little bit like Stravinsky, but more like in his own way. He's exploring 12-tone music. Now, of course, he uses it in a completely different way than any of the new Viennese school composers. It's not properly serial music. But the 12th quartet opens with these 12 notes on the cello, which go up, and they're completely dissonant. You don't know what the hell is going to happen. And then they land in a beautiful, rich D-flat major. and so that bar, which then gets developed later in the development, is one of the bars that shows that Shostakovich was interested in that. And that's, you know, quite a lot of his later works, and the Second Cello Concerto and the block songs. You get instances of that. But the 12th quartet, he particularly loved it because it was a sort of symphonic work. And the first movement, which is quite long, it's nothing like as long as the second movement. It's very complex and long. But I find it a really satisfactory, beautiful work because it's constructed from simple beginnings. You know, he then put things on top of each other, and it's very beautiful at the beginning. After you have the funny bar at the beginning, and I love it. So.
Good. Let's listen. That was the opening of Shostakovich's 12th string quartet, played by the Borodin Quartet. Very fascinating it was too. I'd never heard it, I don't think. I heard quite recently the second quartet, played wonderfully by the Pavel Haas Quartet. That was
Super.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Lovely quartet, yeah, and very good quartet, the Pavel Haas.
Yeah.
I love that kind of Schoenbergian waltz, the second subject. You know, it's sort of saying, yeah, well, I can be a little bit like Schoenberg too.
Well, I'm glad he wasn't allowed to be too much like Schoenberg. I like Shostakovich as he is. Okay, sorry, to go back to Moscow, because we are going back to Moscow. Were you ever approached by any spies? Soviet? I mean, were you asked to inform at all? It'd be a bit dangerous, an ambassador's daughter.
No, I think I wasn't, and I was obviously a prime target in one sense. And I saw things happen to other students which were not very nice and upsetting. So I was quite lucky. And I have to say that I have a feeling that the Soviets thought my father was kind of, quite relatively well disposed towards them amongst other diplomats and had a better understanding, and therefore they didn't want to touch him or his family. I have that feeling. But I remember, this is quite funny if you actually think of the kind of person my father was, who was sort of, he never talked to me about, he talked to me about music and lots of things, but he would never talk to me about boyfriends or girlfriends or sex or anything like that. And just before I went to Moscow, he had to give me this sort of pep talk. And he would said, now, my dear, just supposing somebody put something into a drink of yours and you discover you pass out and you wake up and you're in bed with somebody, she said, don't worry, these things can happen, but you have to go and tell the British Embassy next. So I had this rather peculiar version of what could happen. Well, but I was quite careful. People came to the hostel to try and sell me, beautiful golden samovar or icons, and I knew that was provocation, and I said, please go away. I can't, I don't want it, and I haven't got any money anyway, I say, because they wanted it in dollars, and that was illegal. So the answer is yes, I had a few of those cases.
Because Mario Welsh, who also studied in Moscow,
yes.
That was after you were there?
No, it was while I was there. I know that story very well, and it was very upsetting. Yeah.
Drugged. But he also got a visit from MI5 when he got home.
Oh, right.
Everything he said, they somehow twisted it. Yes. Yeah, it must have been fascinating. I remember I've been to Russia several times. I seem to have cancelled 3 performances there in the last year or so. I'm supposed to go and play with the Russian Youth Orchestra later this year, I think. But I used to find it fascinating when it was Soviet times. I mean, awful in a way, but also absolutely fascinating. I went first in '84 and then again in '87. But it was also, it was awful in a way, but it was also, for me, much more interesting than it is now, when it was such a different world.
It's quite frightening now, actually, because there's not very much democracy. I did have another not very nice experience a bit later when Misha Maisky had come out to the West. And at the time, he had a girlfriend who had sort of saved his life, if you like, saved his sanity when he was in prison.
Saved his sanity?
Kind of.
Well,
let us say, in the circumstance that he was in a prison, not in a prison camp. He was working in a factory in very, very grim circumstances for a while. And I think somebody with Misha's sensibility could really have lost it then. And this family befriended him, and the girl was in love with him, and he and her and everything. And when he left, there was a kind of feeling that he had to do his best to try and get her to come out. And I was taking a letter. I was going on a visit to Russia, and I took a letter. And for some reason, I don't know, I think I put it in a book or something. I thought, if they start looking through my handbag. Anyway, whatever happened at the airport, they did give me a thorough searching, and they found the letter. And they started reading it, and they said, "Why have you got this letter?" I said, "Oh, I've got to give it to a friend at the conservatoire." Something. "Oh, you should put it in the post. You know perfectly well that the Soviet post works very well." So I ended up, I felt a terrible traitor. I felt awful. And I had to go, and this girl was living with Lisa Leonska, the pianist, wonderful pianist. And Lisa was being very, very kind to her and did everything in her power. And her name came into it, and I just felt awful. I thought, "Lisa, I just hope nothing happens. And, you know, you have to go down on my bended knee in front of you." But that was awful, because I felt like a traitor to a personal friend. And in the end, what happened, the girl was going to get married to a foreigner, you know, somebody who was going to go out, get a visa, and then she'd rejoin Misha. And in the end, she fell in love with the person she was meant to have the false marriage with, and she never went. So that was the end of that story.
Fell in love with her husband. That's unheard of.
Well, a lot of people got false marriages to get out. The first famous one was the wonderful composer Andrei Volkonsky, and Volkonsky came from a princely family, very famous, so the Decembrist Prince Volkonsky, and he was born in Geneva and brought up in Paris, had lessons with Nadia Boulanger and Dino Lipati. Then he came back to Russia when he was 16, 17, and his parents got sent off to where his family had estates. They were kind of put into exile. Anyway, he became Russia's first avant-garde composer. The first piece of serial music was written by him. And he was a fascinating man. He was an excellent harpsichordist, and he also founded a madrigal group, early music. And anyway, compositions were banned, and he could no longer be performed. And at a certain point, in about 73, he actually left, but he left by marrying a Jewish lady who was meant to be going to Israel, and apparently she was terribly excited that she could become a princess, a valid prince, when she left. And but they stuck to their agreement, and as soon as they got out to the West, he dropped her and said, "That's it, you've done your part, I've done my part." And so these things were quite common.
No. And why, sorry, it's really off topic now, but why do you think Prokofiev went back to Russia in the 30s?
Well, there were a lot of people wanting to go back at that time, more than one thinks. And another thing is that in Paris, there was a big movement called the Eurasian movement, was founded in Paris and in Prague, and also in England, Mirsky. And they were all actually quite left-wing. They all sympathized with the communists. And a lot of them applied to go back. The Mirsky was the name of the man in Oxford who was a British Eurasian Russian, and he went back, and of course he died in the Gulag in 1937. The Russians in Paris was called Pierre Suchinsky, an enormously important person, because he was a friend of Stravinsky and Prokofiev, and he founded the Domaine Musical with Boulez and Messiaen, and so he was involved with all the sort of contemporary music. Anyway, in the 1936, he wanted to go back to Russia, and he applied to go back. He was refused. So, and in the same year, he was involved with Prokofiev. He put the texts together for that cantata for the 20th anniversary of the revolution, which is a fantastic work.
зависит от 2-3 дней. Погибнуть всем, но не пропустить неприятеля.
Of course, it was never performed in Soviet Russia. It was a bit too, it was too way out. And
Okay.
Prokofiev, another of Prokofiev's failed projects. Yeah.
Many of them, well, including the cello concerto, which I love, but wasn't a success.
Yes, well, many things he wrote which were not performed, and even Romeo and Juliet. It took 4 years for them to decide to actually stage it. You can't believe it. It was, the most popular piece of music of the 20th century. Almost. There we are.
Right, so we're still in Russia, and you've chosen next Richter and Oleg Kagan and Natasha Gutman playing Ravel.
Well, I couldn't not have in my playlist Natasha Gutman, because she's enormously wonderful cellist and a great friend, and Sid is a great friend. And I've had the privilege of working with her for a long time. And she kind of befriended me when I was a student, and I did all kinds of things, met lots of people, interesting people through her. And she certainly introduced me to Volkonsky, for instance. I went to hear their recital of the Gamba sonatas. He played the harpsichord. And then she got to know Oleg Kagan more or less at my graduation party. My parents threw a party, and they started something then in '69. And of course, they had an absolutely fabulous musical rapport. And their Brahms double was, was marriage. I don't think I've ever heard anybody else play quite the same understanding and togetherness as they had. And he was a wonderful person too, and tragically died of cancer in 1990, very young, 44 years old, I think he was. Anyway, that's another part of life, but I kept up with them all the time. They were my great friends. And of course, he started playing with Richter quite early. And Richter adored playing Mozart with him and lots of other things. And Natasha would have been playing with him much earlier, but Richter's wife didn't want it. No. So, no, she forbade her. For 16 years, Natasha was unable to play with Richter, 16 years. And
how did she get away with it?
Well, it's a long story, but Richter's had an artist friend who designed his dacha, and Richter's wife, Nina Dorliak, fell in love with him. And he then married Natasha. Natasha's first husband was this man, Vladimir Moroz. and Richter's wife never forgave her. And but I have to say, Natasha, when she played at the Tchaikovsky competition, she played the Prokofiev Symphony Concertante, and she went to have lessons on it with Richter. And
who had conducted the first performance.
Exactly. So there's, it's all quite complex. But then at long last, she was released and allowed to play, provided Oleg was there as well. And then eventually they started playing various sonatas together. They played Hindemith and Britten and, what else did they play? Prokofiev, obviously, sonatas. But I just thought this was a lovely concert. It's not a very chamber-like situation because they're in the big hall of the Moscow Conservatoire in this. But anyway, I love this recording myself. And shall we listen to a bit? First movement of the Ravel Piano Trio.
The opening of the Ravel piano trio played by Richter, Kagan, not Kogan, but Kagan, Oleg Kagan, and Natasha Gutman. And you knew them all. Well, you still know Natasha. Very well. And well, we haven't really mentioned, well, we're going to come on to your latest book, but you mentioned the Jacqueline du Pré book, the Rostropovich book you've done, and also the amazing, wonderful Shostakovich book, which we all use as our sort of Bible of Shostakovich, because you just got to talk to people before they vanished who really, really knew him. And,
well, I was very lucky because I never thought of writing a book anyway. I didn't consider I was able to. And I suddenly got an email from Faber and Faber's asking if I would do this book. And it was something that was passed on by Gerard McBurney. He'd been invited to do the book and he hadn't got time or he didn't want to do it. And he said, oh, Lisa's the person to do it. And I said, well, Gerard, but I don't know how to write. How can I possibly do that? He said, oh, you don't need to write that book. It was going to be in a series called Composers Remembered. And so I thought, oh, well, that'll be interesting. And I thought I had lots of things going for me. The fact that I had studied in Russia in the time and that I had met Shostakovich, I knew his family, and I had a way in, if you like. And that seemed to me an ideal opportunity and something that I should understand was important. And also when I started collecting evidence, it was the late 80s. So it was the beginning of glasnost and the fact that the Soviet Union was actually coming to an end. And a lot of people were trying to unburden themselves and talk when they had been frightened to talk before. Now, that had its dangers because some people were trying to justify some of their past actions. But on the other hand, it was also good because I could talk to people, and one thing led to another. I met through one person, another person, so forth, and I met fascinating people, and I met people who unfortunately didn't actually let me record their interviews. For instance, Shostakovich's nephew, because he intended to write himself, and poor man, he had a stroke and he never was able to.
So you never use it.
So I know what he told me, and I remember it. And this happened in several cases. I know what people told me. And it's part of my kind of knowledge, if you like, in my...
Well, I hope you've written it down somewhere.
Yeah, I have. And I'm actually going to be doing that now. I've decided I'm going to do that a little bit more. And the fact that I'd lived there for quite a lot, 5 or 6 years, helped me understand a little bit about it. And and of course, the other thing is that I decided, apart from anything else, that most of the material that had been published in Russia had not been published in English. And therefore, there was a vast amount of material that was unknown. And therefore, I decided to ask if you would take it out of the series and write something which is a kind of mosaic biography. I don't quite know how to explain it, but I use a lot of evidence by other people. Now, that is good and bad, because when you're quoting somebody else, you try and see if it's, verifiable in the truth, but it's not always verifiable. So you get into a situation where Julian Barnes could come along and say, oh, I love this bit about the man that he went out and waited by the lift to be arrested. Now, that was told to me by Yuri Lyubimov, who is the theatre director, who was a great storyteller and everything. But I don't quite know where he got it, and I don't know. So a lot of stuff in there is a little bit legendary, if you like, in that sense. And I try and distinguish that this is sort of more likely to be legendary, and this is more likely to be fact, and it can be verified by the facts that we know. And by now, of course, I talk now, there's an incredible amount of new stuff that goes on, because the widow Shostakovich, Irina Antonovna, has founded the archive, and she has 4 or 5 people working in it, doing research. They've published a lot. They've got a publishing house, and they're trying to do the complete works in new editions. So the Russians, who had never really done proper research before, the days I was writing, there was nothing reliable. Because either it was ideologically warped and very communist, and he was always a wonderful member of the Communist Party and thought like a communist, and his works had communist ideological messages, and we know that wasn't the case. And then you had Solomon Volkov, whose book was very important, The Testimony, and which we now know is slightly put together from different sources, including published sources.
Together, isn't it?
Well, yeah, anyway, another thing has occurred to me as I get older and I know a little bit more. I've been researching the story that comes into the Judina legend, that Judina supposedly recorded Mozart's A major concerto during one night for Stalin at Stalin's behest, and that's the beginning of the film Death of Stalin. So it's a legend, it's an enduring legend. Anyway, when I was in Russia 18 months ago, I decided to research and see what I could find, and I went to the radio archives to see, did she make any radio recordings of that particular concerto? And I found out what the real date of the recording was, and I tried to follow various paths. And I've never really actually believed. I thought that's an extraordinary story. It's a great story, but I've never believed it. The other thing is that she was supposed to have given all the money to the church, that Stalin sent her a lot of money, supposedly. We don't know that. There's no written proof anywhere that still exists. Maybe there was, but there isn't now, that we can find. And she was meant to have given it to the church. Now, everybody knows she was very religious, but people don't know that she had stopped going to church in 1927 when there was a schism in the church, because the official Orthodox Church became kind of an ally of the Communist Party. And the people who didn't want this and felt it was an absolute selling themselves down the river, became part of another movement called the Josephite movement, which she was part of, and they were then all arrested and taken away to Siberia, and so not much was left of them. And she remained a Christian, but she didn't go to church and she didn't confess, which you have to be if you're a proper member of the Orthodox Church. And therefore it's very unlikely she would have suddenly given money to a church. If she had given it, she wasn't a congregation member. She wasn't. So that was another part of the story I disbelieved. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I'm very skeptical, and I start to be skeptical about other stories, because I've just recently discovered that the story that the lift that we talked about, Rostropovich waiting on the floor of the lift, it's connected with the fact that he was expecting to be arrested in context with Marshal Tukhachevsky, who was arrested in the Great Purges, 1937. And he'd been a sponsor of Shostakovich. He was actually a violinist and a musician of a kind in his spare time, and even made violins. But anyway, there was a particular interrogator who interrogated Shostakovich and then let him go home and said, come back on Monday and you will find that we'll then continue the talk and you'll continue to remember what you know about Tukhachevsky. Apparently he came on that Monday and the investigator had disappeared, had been arrested. Well, recently I've discovered a little bit more about this investigator and discovered that he was arrested, but not in Leningrad. He was arrested in Moscow. And of course, Shostakovich lived in Leningrad at the time. And what happened, he was transferred from Leningrad to Moscow. So there's a certain amount of wild exaggeration in this story.
And what about the K488, the recording by Judina? Is it? I mean, there is a recording, but
there is a recording.
But it wasn't done in one night for Stalin.
I don't think so. I mean, I put it into my book. I put it into an appendix by itself, so as not to interrupt the story. But I don't think there's any reason for us to believe that. And I am beginning to come to the conclusion that Shostakovich liked inventing stories, but good stories. I mean, based on some facts, but then he would exaggerate them. And Rostropovich always said that. You see, he said to me, he loved telling stories, and I know he told at least 2 or 3 stories that didn't happen. So I just think we can add these ones to them because the source seems to be him.
That's interesting. But did you talk to Khrennikov or Kabalevsky?
I never talked to Khrennikov. I avoided him. Kabalevsky I met, and actually Rostropovich gave me 2 of his works with his signature on them. Mm-hmm. I have the cello sonata. Mm-hmm. Have you got one? The cello sonata. His signature. Well, perhaps I should give you my copy.
Oh, no. It should be in the archive.
Well, I don't really have an archive. I've given most, my Shostakovich archive has gone to Bristol University.
Is it? That's interesting. There's supposed to be another Kabalevsky sonata and 2 little pieces he wrote as well. Supposed to appear sometime. And
anyway, I gave the concerto, I gave it to somebody else. So I kind of met him, but I never talked to him.
Because Michael Berkeley met him and Khrennikov together and said Khrennikov was a nightmare and Kabalevsky was charming.
I'm sure Kabalevsky could have been charming, and probably Khrennikov must have managed to exercise some kind of charm. How else would he have got Stravinsky to come to Russia in 1962? They met in Hollywood.
Dying to go back to Russia.
Yeah, well, yes, evidently enough.
Sorry, so your book, anyway, Udina, since that's the next music we hear. So is it out yet, your book?
No, it's not. I've delivered it and I'm waiting to hear from my editors. They've given me publication date as beginning of January next year because they're very behind.
Is that Faber?
No, I'm not doing it for Faber's this time. I'm doing it for Yale University Press. Yeah. No, I have to say that Belinda, our friend Belinda Matthews, is very good at answering letters. And,
yes.
And she's bringing up my Rostropovich book in a second edition.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah. I think it'll be a paperback one this time.
Oh, that's good.
I've been able to correct a few little errors.
Oh, that's good. She just gave me a lecture. She called me up. She said, Stephen, you're making so many corrections in your new book. We're starting to run behind schedule. We're not showing you another draft. Okay, sorry.
Oh. Well, they're all behind schedule because of COVID.
Well, I only wrote the book because of COVID anyway. I wouldn't have written it otherwise. So anyway, Udina, just give us a very quick, for those people who don't know about Udina, give us and also there's also a legend that she used to sleep in a coffin. That's not true, is it? But what about the stories about her in Testimony? Are they true? Was Stalin really scared of her?
No, I don't think. I think Maria Udina was an extraordinary figure. She was a concert pianist, very well-known concert pianist, but and she was born on the turn of the century, 1899, in a small town in the Pale of Settlement called Neville, near Vitebsk, which is more famous because Vitebsk is where Chagall comes from, and they had a wonderful school of art there. And she not only was a wonderful pianist, she studied at the St. Petersburg Conservatoire from the age of 13 with Yesipova, the teacher of Prokofiev, and many others. She studied conducting, she studied orchestra, she studied composition, she studied organ, bit of everything. And she sang in choirs, and she said no pianist should play Bach unless they've sung his music in a choir. So there you are. But she was also extraordinary because she knew so many people. She studied at St. Petersburg University, and she studied history and medieval history and philosophy. And when the revolution happened in 1917, she went home to her small town of Neville, and it suddenly became the philosophical center of Russia because at the time, the capital cities, Moscow and St. Petersburg, were starving. They had no food, no fuel. People were living very badly. And so people would go off to the country to live. And just by chance, the biggest name in Russian philosophical literary criticism was Mikhail Bakhtin. And he turned up in Neville with another 2 or 3 important philosophers, and they formed a circle of which she was a member. And Bakhtin said, well, Udina, very unusually for a woman, was a real philosopher. And she didn't just philosophize, she knew how to talk about philosophy deeply. Anyway, Mikhail Bertin became a lifelong friend of hers, and he had a very interesting biography, and she was very much part of it. And then she knew people like Pavel Florensky, who was an extraordinary priest, a kind of Leonardo da Vinci figure, who was a mathematician and a scientist, and he worked on Lenin's pet project of the electrification of the Soviet Union, and it founded about 9 or 10 patents for the Soviet Union, as well as writing extraordinary books about art. He taught at the art school, and he wrote a famous book called Inverse Perspective Going Out and Not Coming In. Or the other way around. Anyway, it's about icons and how icons function. The way it's very. And he was also a good amateur musician. And anyway, she became a very close friend of his. And of course, he was a spiritual leader. And so that's another. Then she became very friendly with a lot of the literary circles. She was a close friend of Pasternak. And Pasternak first read Dr. Zhivago privately in her house for about 20 people. So, she had this enormous range of interests. And every now and then she would, meet her architecture. At one time she thought she was engaged in architecture. She became very interested in architecture and started studying architecture, and she decided she would give up the piano and become an architect, or she'd give up the piano and become a nurse or a doctor. There were lots of other things that interested her. She had brilliant start to her career. She won the gold medal and the prize together with Sofronitsky, another wonderful pianist. And at the age of 22, she was appointed to the staff of the Petrograd Conservatoire, I should say, and was a full-time professor at the age of 23. And then she was kicked out of it at the age of 30 because she was religious. And there was the whole side I started to mention earlier about the schism in the church and her belonging to the Josephites, the ones who did not want any compromise with the Soviet regime. So she was thrown out because of her religious tendencies, and she wandered around. Then she got a job in Tbilisi, in Tiflis, as a teacher in Georgia for a short while. And then she ended up in Moscow, and that's where she stayed. And she got employed by the Moscow Conservatoire for many years when Neuhaus was the director. And then she was thrown out of that in 1950. And then she taught at the Gnesins Academy, or the Gnesins Institute as it was there, until she was thrown out in 1960. And in 1960, she was not only accused of being religious, but of being a propagator of contemporary music. Because after the so-called thaw began in the late 50s, we have to remember in 1957, Glenn Gould went to Russia and played extraordinary concerts, and he was the first person to openly play the New Viennese School, Hindemith, Schenik. Apart from also playing some Bach and Art of Fugue and the Goldberg Variations. Yeah, or part. I don't think he played it all. He did play some of it. Anyway, and then the New York Philharmonic went in 1959 with Bernstein, and they played Stravinsky and other things. They played Stravinsky and Shostakovich, just East and West Russian. Lots and lots of other stuff as well. Anyway, Yudina saw, like everybody else, this is a green light. We can go ahead and play this music. And she was the first to do so. She was way ahead of everybody else. And she got in touch with Stravinsky. She got in touch with Pierre Suvchinsky, who I mentioned before, who was a friend of Stravinsky. And through him, she got letters from Boulez, from Messiaen. Stockhausen sent her his pieces. And she had all this stuff. Some of it she didn't actually play. She intended to play it. But what happened, it was like she opened the path for other artists. And if you know the pianist Alexei Lyubimov,
slightly,
anyway, he was Mr. Contemporary Music when I was a student, and he played all the things that she didn't play. He went way ahead of her, but it was an extraordinary time. And for instance, she knew that this young pianist was terribly interested in contemporary music. She said, "Listen, I'm going to the airport to meet Stravinsky. You come along too, and I'll introduce you." She was that kind of person. She would like to share her enthusiasms. And she lived in abject poverty, really. She never had anything, not because she didn't earn money. She did earn money, but she gave it all away, or to her brother who was a schizophrenic, or to somebody else. There was always somebody who was more worthy than her.
Sounds very right. So let's hear, having heard about Maria Yudina and Stravinsky and how they were friends, shall we hear her play some of the sonata? So that was the finale of Stravinsky's Piano Sonata, played by Maria Yudina, whose biography is going to appear early next year, written by our guest Lisa Wilson. And you also wanted us to hear Maria Yudina playing Brahms. So that was Brahms, part of Opus 116, number 2, played by Maria Udina. What attracts you to that playing particularly?
Well, it's partly to do with her biography. She wrote quite a lot about Brahms, and very interestingly about the elegiac character of late Brahms, those miniature pieces from 116, 17, 18, 19, yeah. And she had a very special attitude towards romanticism in general, and it was a literary, she would have taken the elegy in its literary form as a kind of key to the understanding of the elegiac in music. And she also had, with this particular piece, she had a personal association. She considered it to be the abandoned girl, and I think she associated herself at an earlier stage in her life with that unhappy love affair, who knows. And she played this piece in a concert in 1930, just as she was being expelled from the Leningrad Conservatoire, and in a very dangerous way. I mean, she could have been arrested, and she gave a concert, and people adored her, that she had an enormous following, and people came along to the concert, and after each piece she played, they would bring up flowers and messages, little icons, and they had an enormous wreath which saying, the darker the sky, the brighter the stars, and things like that. With this, and that concert she played had a Prokofiev Fourth Sonata. I can't remember, a lot of other pieces which were for her very personal, and each one had a particular meaning. So she had this idea of associating meaning to pieces of music, sometimes effectively and sometimes not. But it's a very personal attitude, and like it or not, you can't deny its strength, if you like. I mean, for instance, she was known during the war to play very, very loudly some Bach or something, and Neuhaus or somebody asked, "Why are you playing so loudly?" He said, "Because it's a war." And people felt she was playing as if they'd already captured Berlin a few years before it happened. But that was a kind of artist she was, if you like. And I mean, with the Stravinsky too, or the modern music, she tried always to invest it with emotion and character. Whereas Stravinsky, as you probably noticed, has given the movement just a metronome mark. It says crotchet equals 112. Well, she played quite a lot faster than that. I don't know if you remember the finale, but it's more like 130 or something. I don't know. But on the other hand, you go back and listen to Stravinsky playing, and it's terribly boring in comparison. So there must be a kind of
he must have heard her play it, right?
Yes, he did hear her play. Yes, he did. Of course he did. When he came to Leningrad, he did hear. She organized an exhibition of his whole life, and at the Union of Composers in Leningrad, and she also played the septet there, and got students to play the octet. So she organized these things. It was pretty amazing. And one has a feeling that perhaps Stravinsky, he would have said, she said, "I know that I play too fast the outer movements for your liking, but he may not have liked it stylistically." He tended to say that he wanted music to be very objective, and the last thing she was when she played was objective. The interesting story is about the Schubert B-flat sonata with Richter, because I think Richter, everybody knows that he plays extremely slowly, that sonata. Not only does he play extremely slowly, he is persistently slow, and he never changes the tempo. Now, when you listen to Maria Udina play that sonata, it's much slower to begin with than Richter. You think, it's really, so you have the kind of quaver going da ram bum 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 dee da dee. So but then she gets faster and she does things with it, and becomes probably completely hysterical for somebody like Radu, who probably hates it. But I can listen to it and I really enjoy it. I think it has its own sense and logic. Yeah. And interestingly enough, she fell in love with that Schubert sonata through Schnabel, who came to Leningrad in the mid-20s, and she adored Schnabel, thought he was wonderful. And she'd say to her students, imitate in Schnabel in absolutely everything except in the faces he makes when he plays. So
Yeah, so well, it's all very, well, your book sounds fascinating. We shall look forward to that. Oh, I forgot to tell you one story. I can't remember whether I ever told you this before. Well, actually, the last time I played in Moscow, which was some time ago now, as I say, I keep having to cancel things there. But I played The Protecting Veil by John Tavener. And then
Oh, yes.
a pianist friend of mine brought this lady around afterwards who looked familiar. I thought I'd met her, but I couldn't remember how. And I told you, my Russian is like 2-year-old's Russian. And this friend said something about this woman having met Shostakovich. I was like, wow, you met Shostakovich? She looked at me and said, I was married to him.
It was Irina Shostakovich. Were you playing The Protecting Veil?
I was, although I once played Shostakovich 1. That's why I met her in Paris. And she was
yes. I have to say, Irina Shostakovich is the ideal widow. She has done so much. And I admire her enormously because she's not a musician herself, but she was a literary editor. And she has put all the money from, well, maybe not all of it, but most of the money she has received from the royalties, she's put back into a publishing house, into the archive, into investing. And she's not at all a person who says, you can't publish this because I don't like it. She's quite open. And I think that's very unusual.
Yeah,
I have a fantastic admiration for her.
That's great. Yeah, so I love the Shostakovich. I use it for the sonata and both concertos, the complete Shostakovich edition. It's so much better. Wonderful.
I think you've seen the recent sonata edition, yeah.
I've got
the Shostakovich sonata edition, because you play the second movement reprise in the Ponticello, which I've seen it. I've seen all the manuscripts. In fact, I've got an article. I've got to publish it, in which I praise your beautiful performance.
Good. It sounds like an excellent article. Yes, it should definitely be published tomorrow. And the stopped harmonics at the end of the slow movement, also from the manuscript. Yeah, it's from that complete Shostakovich edition, as I said. It's the only one I will use. And so I guess we're getting to we have been talking for well over 3 hours.
Oh my goodness.
So I was very intrigued by your last choice, which is the Castalian Quartet, which is the favourite young quartet of the guy I mentioned who is my best friend since I'm 16. Since I was 16, David Waterman. He adores them. I know Cindy, the leader, I played with her.
Oh, yes.
And playing the Fauré Quartet, which, of course, I worship Fauré. My son is named after Fauré. I adore him.
Yes. Well, there's a bit of a long story, and I'll try and make it a short story. I think I mentioned earlier that we run a string quartet course in Italy. We started it, we being myself and my colleague. There's an American girl called Christine Anderson and a wonderful Irish violinist called Eilish Kranich. And the three of us decided that in Italy there were no proper summer courses for chamber music at the time we were talking about, in the mid-90s. And so kids didn't start doing quartets in conservatoire till quite late, when they were students, and they didn't have any kind of background to it. So our model was Hugh Maguire's quartet course in Ireland called Concorda. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you've heard about it, but it's kind of like Procorda, which is another wonderful quartet course for young people. And not only quartets, they do other kinds of chamber music too. So we base our course on this kind of model. And we have it in a wonderful place, high up in the mountains, 1,700 meters, a place called Prakatinat. And it's about 70 kilometers west of Turin. And we go there in the summer. And Hugh Maguire used to say, we've arrived in paradise when we got there. And anyway, this quartet course had people coming from really all over the world. We had a partnership with Ireland, with Holland and France, I think, to begin with. And the Irish, unfortunately, no longer can come because they put their own course at the same dates as ours. So that's gone by the wayside. But during the many years, we've had many people who've gone on to become professional quartet players. Others, of course, are not. They enjoy chamber music, but they've taken on ordinary careers, or they become lawyers, or I don't know what they become, doctors, other professions, as is normal. We also want an audience for our quartets, don't we, and for our chamber music. So it's very important to have that. It's been a great success in Italy. And one year, about 15 years ago now, more than 15 years ago, we had this wonderful student from Manchester called Daniel Roberts, who came for two or 3 years running. And he was very, very friendly with a wonderful Russian teacher we had called Masha Yanushevskaya, who lived in Paris and was a pupil of Belinsky's and adored quartets. And she was in a quartet which won various competitions, a wonderful player and teacher. Anyway, what happened was that this wonderful Masha I talked about died in 2015, and Daniel Roberts, who I'd lost touch with, got in touch with me again and said, "Oh, I was so upset to read about this. Can you tell me?" So I said, "Yes, of course I can. I'll tell you. And what's more, we're having a memorial service for this summer. Can't you come?" He said, "Yes, I'll come, but I'll come with my quartet." I said, "Oh, tell me about your quartet." It's a Castalian quartet. And so from there, he has come, and then he's been coming back as our teacher. And we're so happy to have somebody who's been to the course, who's now very much a beloved and very much appreciated teacher. So I think they're a wonderful quartet. And I've been talking about so many old musicians. I thought it's time to talk about some young ones, and think how wonderful that they've got a lot of imagination. They don't play sort of standard, brilliant, all together, all vertical. They have far more imagination in my mind. And they're also a quartet made up of 4 different nationalities, I think. The viola player is French, Simon, and the first violin comes from Finland, Daniel Roberts from Wales, our second violin, and the wonderful cellist called Chris Graves, who is English or Scottish, I don't know where but he's British anyway. And why Fauré? Now I have to tell you, my father was a great influence on me, and he adored French music, and he adored Fauré. And I used to listen when I was young to Gérard Souzet, the wonderful French baritone singing the romances, which I adore. I nearly chose one of those, but I thought, let's have instead a young quartet playing some of this wonderful music. And as you know, this was Fauré's very last work. So it's a very moving work. It's kind of retrospective in one way, and also it's got a lot of innovation in it in its way, and it's wonderful way he uses harmony like nobody else. That's why he can impose one harmony on top of another. It's very subtle. It's fantastic.
Yes, no argument from me there. Okay, let's hear some of the slow movement. So that was part of the slow movement of Gabriel Fauré's last work, his only string quartet, played by the Castalian Quartet. Very beautifully. Gorgeous.
Very beautiful.
That's that piece. It took me years to get inside that piece, and once I was inside it, I fell in love. It's just
I think that all the bigger pieces, not the kind of the piano quartet is the one that gets plays most, and that's more obvious. But even the second cello sonata, which is wonderful, it takes time to get into it, doesn't it?
And once you're in it, you never want to get out. One of my very favourite composers. I don't know why, I just love them so much. That's fascinating. I think you should write your autobiography next.
Well, I'm starting to put together bits that I've, little bits of memoirs, if you listen to that, because I'm writing about other people. It's always much more, I don't particularly fancy writing about myself, but you get into writing about yourself because you're writing about somebody else. You see what I mean?
The other way around,
Yeah. Now, I want to ask you a question, Stephen, because I have a memory years ago when you must have been a boy that I went with Rostropovich, I think, would it have been the cello center? But he was told about this fascinating, talented boy, and he sort of told me, and I trying to remember, I kind of have a remember of a curly-haired boy who probably didn't really want to play to Rostropovich. Is that right? Could that be you? Or was it somebody else?
I think that was probably Marius May. That sounds more like Marius.
No, it wasn't Marius May. I can remember Marius.
Late.
But well, I don't know, but I have.
No, but I remember once you called me up because you had but that was later. It must have been about must have been around 1985 or something. You called me up because Rostropovich had just found, or anyway, I'd written him a letter, and he'd found it like a year after I'd written it, and had written me a most wonderful letter, which I hope I still have somewhere, in reply, because I'd been to Baku in 1984, and I was telling the old man I met on the beach who'd babysat for him. Anyway, yes, I remember you. I think you brought this letter round because he didn't know where I was. Yeah.
I must have known who you were before that. Come on.
He did. But he didn't know where.
I mean, I heard you were a Wigmore's recital, and I
see. Well, we met at
the
cello centre, but Rostropovich never came there. That I would remember. I remember
you. Or maybe then he just talked about you, who he'd been. Something I can't remember.
Several curly-haired young cellists at that point.
There are not so many bald ones, but they exist as well.
Yes, it's not a bad start. Great. So, Lisa Wilson, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. I knew you'd be fascinating, but I didn't know you'd be that fascinating. I mean, you just know everybody, and you've been everywhere, and you know so much. It's been great, and loved your choice of music. Again, very individual and wonderful. And it's been great to talk to you. I've always meant to ask you about all this stuff, and now I could do it.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for thinking of inviting me, and thank you for interviewing me. I think next time we should do it the other way around. I'd like to ask you a lot of questions.
I said quite a bit, as it was. Anyway, great. And hopefully see you in person before too long.
I hope so. I hope so.
Putney music in person before too long. All right. Well, lovely.
Okay. Lots of love and keep well.